So welcome everyone to the SureCloud monthly threat briefing. I'm joined again today by Hugh Rayner. Welcome, Hugh. Good afternoon to you. How's things going?
Yeah, pretty good. Back to normal weather now, so I can't complain.
Yeah, it's a little bit more palatable. Yeah, so we've got three subjects for you today that we're gonna get through, and these are all kind of things that have happened in the industry, in the news in the last month or so. Just things that we picked out. It's obviously been a busy month with various conferences happening like Black Hat and DEF CON and things like that. And we may well touch upon some of the things that were brought out there in a future episode. But there was a couple of things that we picked out and thought that were relevant subjects for this month. So the subjects that we're going to cover today are the attack on Cisco by a Yang Luang ransomware gang. I hope I got the pronunciation right there. We'll do a little breakdown of the attack, the information that we know that's out there, and the Talos guys at Cisco have done an incredible job of highlighting how that's happened and things like that. So we'll give a little bit of brief information around that, and some advice off the back of it as well. So things that we can action now and things that you could take away today to have a look at and start to think about. We're going to break down the phishing attacks on two companies in recent times, Twilio and Cloudflare. The reasons why one failed and one was successful. And again, some actionable insights, so you can take those away and discuss them back at base and work out what your next step should be off the back of that. And then also there was something that caught our eye around ransomware payments and the fact that the NCSC and the ICO have called on the Law Society and obviously the legal profession to kind of support their position on ransomware payments. We'll kind of get a little bit of a discussion between myself and Hugh around the key points there as well. We also had a few questions in since the last threat briefing as well, so that's really, really great to see, and I do encourage people to put them in. One of them we'll answer today because it's very relevant to the things that we talk about, and one relates to quantum computing. We'll address that one offline. Actually, we've got a white paper written that we can share with that person who asked that question, and it's just that we're not covering the topics today, so it would feel a little bit out of place in terms of answering that one. But we'll come back to you on that one separately. So without further ado, we'll get into it. So first up is the Cisco attack. So Hugh, a couple of questions here for myself. Could you talk us through what we know about the attack so far? What's the information that's out there right now, and what happened with the attack? What was the anatomy of it?
Yeah, I think it's really quite an interesting one, because I think of an organization like Cisco, and I would expect an attack against them to be highly sophisticated. But this one, almost seemed like a penetration test with little real attempt to be quiet and slip under the radar. So I think that it seemed to start with Credential Compromise from an employee's personal Google account. And I think they got infected or phished on their own, on their personal account, but then they actually had they were logged in on Chrome with the same account of their personal machine, their corporate machine, and it looks like they were using Chrome's password storage feature for both personal and work purposes as well. So basically what happened was that they managed to compromise the credentials on that individual's machine, and obviously then could dump all of the credential matter stored in Google Chrome as well. So that got them access to their Cisco credentials. From there, it looks like they tried a couple of different things. So they tried phishing, so phishing with voice, calling people up. Seems like they purported to be from a bunch of different support services that they believe Cisco had contracts with. With that, it's quite easy really. There's a few main players that you'd expect a company like Cisco to have, and so you just make a few different calls until you get lucky. Another option they seem to work with was like MFA notification spamming, basically just repeatedly putting those MFA requests in. Especially works on systems where it's a yes or a no prompt rather than a one-time pad. And we get what we call MFA fatigue, where if a user thinks they can see tens of requests one a minute coming through, that can a lot of people think, oh, there's some sort of bug with the system here, and press accept. So that is that is quite a significant risk. We're seeing that occurring quite a lot recently. And yeah, so they were then able to get into that Cisco VPN. From there, I think things sort of slowed down for the attackers. It doesn't look like they managed to sort of move laterally throughout the network much. They were able to elevate their privileges on the machine that they landed on that Citrix instance. They seem to put some tooling on there as well. Things like Hamachi's Log Me In. I think they own that. Tools like TeamViewer, some PowerShell exploit code, and then really common tooling as well, like Mimikatz and InPacket. Definitely those sort of things. It's sort of surprising to hear that it was even possible for those to get those tools onto those machines. Any antivirus is able to pick those up. They put Cobalt Strike on there as well, and not a Cobalt Strike payload, not a beacon, but Cobalt Strike itself. So unsure why they would have tried to put the whole command and control environment there. That sort of struck me as a bit odd. And from there, it was very much penetration test behavior, taking these credentials that they'd obtained, trying them on various machines throughout the network. And despite being sort of quite basic, it definitely seemed to be human led as well. There were typos observed. Scripts don't typically make typos when they're on the command line. And really, all they managed to do, as it seems, is to create a local administrator account on that one machine and access some non-sensitive files off that device before it was detected and shut down.
Excellent, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, so it's I guess it's the boundary between personal use on a company asset and the work kind of boundary of the organization starts to get a little bit blurred, right? So yeah, it's interesting how they leverage that to kind of get the initial foothold into the device or into the user account and go from there. How sophisticated would you say this particular attack is? So it sounds not very, but is there any insights we can gather from what's happened?
Yeah, I think really it is quite low sophistication. It's a phishing attack, which we see a lot of. Whether they were specifically targeting users on personal devices with the hope of accessing credential matter for Cisco, that would be quite a level of sophistication. But I don't know that was necessarily the case, or if they just got lucky. But everything else seems very low sophistication. No tradecraft. They weren't using traffic redirectors with their command and control. So it very much looked like just deploying tooling from the web.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, it does sound not hugely sophisticated. It's worth pointing out as well that the Talos blog, it's well worth a read. It kind of breaks it down nicely into the various stages of the attack. They've noted that they don't believe any sensitive information was exfiltrated. Some information did get out there. So I think they said about 2.8 gigabytes, but it sounds like it's from the personal document storage file system of the user that was originally compromised, and nothing beyond that. And obviously, a company of Cisco's size, you'd expect them to have huge, vast amounts of data, significantly more than 2.8 gigs, for example. So, Talos have said, and Cisco have said, obviously via Talos, that they don't believe there's any sensitive information exfiltrated, and obviously have shared this information on them, the attacker themselves as a learning point. Within the blog as well, Hugh, and you've mentioned a few here. There's a couple of indicators of compromise, so things that happen, so events that would ultimately then lead into becoming an incident that were present here. So what were they, and how could they have helped defensive teams if they did spot them in another organization?
Yeah, and I guess this is the bit that sort of perplexes me the most. Things like deploying those software utilities on the machines. You'd expect that to be logged and sent to a SIEM, especially things like creating new accounts, new user accounts outside of the joiners, movers, leavers process, especially when they're local admin and privileged. Absolutely, I would have expected that to be an instant red flag sent to the the SIEM correlation and shut down almost immediately. It's confusing how they managed to progress, slightly beyond that.
Yeah, I also don't know the answer to this, but it almost feels like they let them run for a little while just to see what happened, in all honesty.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a very bold move. But yeah, I sort of agree with you. I can't see any way in which Cisco wouldn't have the capability to immediately shut that down.
Yeah, potentially they knew that they couldn't get much further than where they were, but we're interested to see the techniques perhaps. I don't know for sure, but that's certainly what it felt like reading it. Okay, good. And for the listeners, what's the immediate recommendations that we can make today? Things to take away and things that we can learn from this piece of information that's out there.
Yeah, so I guess we've touched on them slightly. Looking at this attack, what mistakes were made. I guess the big one there is that merging of business accounts with personal accounts. And I mean, it's an encouraged practice in some places, right? With corporately owned, personally enabled devices. But really, the reason this occurred is because that user had company credentials in their personal Chrome password storage.
Yeah, which I think is easy to do, right? So you install and run Google Chrome for the first time, it will immediately ask you to sign in, and the default action is to sync everything in the background, passwords included, right? So
yeah, and we all like hitting that OK button, right? So when you do log in somewhere and it pops up, would you like this to be remembered? You're not necessarily paying loads of attention. Your little icon that shows you which Chrome profile you're logged in as is pretty small. It's very easy to do to accidentally hit that OK button on the wrong profile and look at the consequences.
No, for sure. And one other recommendation I'd probably add in there is to, if you've got a login system in place, a SIEM solution, for example, or any kind of EDR type tooling, then it's probably wise to have a look at the kind of indicators of compromise here. So adding powerful users, or adding users to a power users group on a local machine basis. You could extend the same to a domain level, so things like a new domain admin being added, a new enterprise admin being added, or any other the power groups. Just make sure that they are being logged, as you expect them to be, and that someone picks up the alert and does something with it in a timely manner, rather than looking back in hindsight and seeing that you've got that data there.
Yeah, and absolutely, and look to extract the most value you can out of the services and software that you're already paying for. So, when you have a penetration test done, don't just treat that in isolation. Go back and look and see. Okay, the pen test team told me that they created this domain admin account. Where was that log? When was that first noticed? When was it escalated? What were we doing? Treat it as an opportunity to assess and develop your own sort of processes around incident management and response.
Perfect. Okay, so to summarize, a non-sophisticated attack that didn't really get very far, didn't exfiltrate a huge amount of sensitive data, and was kind of shut down in a good timely manner eventually. So yeah, I think that's probably a decent summary of it. A couple of learning points out of that as well.
Yeah, you make it sound more boring than I think it is.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, cool. So that's the Cisco attack, just kind of deconstructed a little bit and some learning points out of it. We'll move on to the next point in the agenda today, which was the phishing attacks on the two companies previously mentioned, so Twilio and Cloudflare. So it looks like this was the same attacking group that targeted both organizations with different outcomes, right? So what were the difference between the two examples mentioned? Which one was successful, which one wasn't successful?
Yeah, so it looks like the attackers were able to successfully compromise an account for Twilio and not for Cloudflare, despite almost everything in that attack being the same.
Okay, and what's the reasons why one succeeded and one didn't succeed?
Yeah, that's the interesting bit, right? So basically, it looks like Cloudflare's MFA implementation was really good, right? So they were using FIDO2 authentication, most commonly through little YubiKeys that were hardware tokens that you plug into your USB port. And the way that those are configured is, it's fantastic. I could talk all day about the joys of FIDO2. But basically, when you first set up that multi-factor authentication, it will look at the origin. So it will look at the site with which it is setting up that MFA and binds it to that. It's called origin binding. So no matter what you do, you physically cannot provide that multi-factor authentication credential to a resource which is not, on the same server as the legitimate one. So in the vast majority of cases, this basically eliminates the the chance of phishing attacks facilitating a login. There are a few small number of examples, things like subdomain takeover, where a user, a malicious attacker could register a cloud resource and basically compromise a subdomain. Yes, that probably wouldn't get caught if they were using wildcards on their origin binding. But for the vast majority of cases, that is going to completely nip that in the bud. And I guess the next question is why wouldn't Twilio have adopted that as well? And I think for most organizations, it seems to be a cost thing. These keys are about $50 a key, and I would always recommend that each person enrolled with that MFA is given 2, because you don't want to lose your only one, right? So you keep one in a cupboard and use it in an emergency. But it looks like Cloudflare went the whole way and had this MFA enabled.
Okay, well, at least on the accounts that were targeted, right?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, right? Is that not every account is equal, and so your MFA doesn't always have to be equal across the board. Standard users with limited permissions, app-based MFA, perfectly fine. If you've got 3 or 4 accounts with the keys to the kingdom, $50 or $100 on securing each of those accounts is much less of an ask than all 3,000 of your employees.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, and there's obviously different degrees of MFA, right? So they're not all made equally, they're not all as effective as each other, not all secure as each other. And I know there's, so I guess a sensation I'm getting is that the hardware stuff, the creme de la creme, it's the top of the pile in terms of what you want to have, but it can be quite, I guess, cost prohibitive in some larger organizations if you're doing it for everyone, and possibly, is it as seamless as it sounds? Is it as frictionless as it sounds for implementation?
Yeah, I mean, lots of SSO providers are happily accepting that these days, password managers as well. It is really good. And from the security perspective, it is by far the best MFA implementation you can use. It's probably not one that I'd recommend to most clients, though, because of the cost. Basically, there are other much more easily deployable methods, using a Microsoft Authenticator or something like that. Most people probably either have a personal or a corporate mobile device that they kind of carry with them, and so that's basically a cost-free option. Then you go down that list and look at things like SMS authentication, SMS multi-factor, which again, absolutely much better than no password, than no MFA at all. But SMS is not a service designed to facilitate secure transfer of information, and there are SIM swapping attacks and all manner of things, which reduces the effectiveness of that MFA method.
Okay, so summarize is something's better than nothing in terms of MFA. SMS is better than not having nothing at all, but it's not infallible, and there's probably other attacks there that should be known about. Then you've got to go into your code-based MFA, you're into your alert-based MFA, which, by the way, we talked about in the Cisco example, whereby the spamming of the MFA tokens can often be a bit of an issue as well. And then on top of that, you've got the kind of hardware MFA as well. So yeah, okay, so nice ascending order, but something's better than nothing is kind of the message.
Absolutely. If you can only go to the bottom rung of that ladder, it's better than staying on the floor.
Okay, excellent. Are there any other recommendations off the back of that discussion that we can make to the listeners today?
I think we probably covered
it. Brilliant, excellent. Okay, cool. The third topic of today then is around the news that the NCSC and the ICO. So they've written a joint letter addressed to the Law Society. So the key facts are that ransomware remains the biggest online threat to UK organisations today, right? So that's not gone away. It's not got worse. Well, it probably has got worse, actually. It's not got any better, ultimately. So as we well know, and as we've talked about in previous episodes extensively, and you'll have to tune into the news on a very infrequent basis. So every other day, every week, there seems to be a new attack on someone that's ransomware related. So they've issued a joint letter to the Law Society, and the letter is there to remind the Law Society, so people sign up to the Law Society of what the ransomware advice is from the NCSC and the ICO. The emphasis on that paying a ransom is not necessarily guaranteed to keep your data safe, and in the eyes of the ICO, it's not necessarily a mitigation in a regulatory action either. So it's worth kind of pointing those kind of pieces out. And it is also kind of understood that in some cases, solicitors have been known to be advising their customers to pay a ransom ultimately. So we wanted to have a little discussion around these points, and in particular the implications of that letter. So I guess the question I would have for you, Hugh, is this an ideologically sound but practically infeasible idea here? So are we talking about something that's, ideologically we can all agree that we shouldn't pay these things, but when it all comes, when push comes to shove and the pressure's on, is that where we really start to kind of see that ideological viewpoint fall apart?
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate, isn't it? I'd be surprised if the NCSC and the ICO went the next step and looked to implement legislation here. I think that would cause a huge amount of friction. Of course, we all know, no one's oblivious to the what happens when you pay a ransom, right? That money goes towards funding further serious organized crime, more malware development, attacking further organizations, industry peers, and even more than that, yourself in the future. Because as soon as you pay a ransom, you get added to a list of, hey, great, these people pay ransoms. This is fantastic. So you're buying yourself some short-term respite. But when you look at it on the flip side, if you've been ransomed for $50,000 and you can see that it's going to take you 6 months and $800,000 to get back to where you were, I don't know how any business could, with its best interests at heart, come to the decision of not paying that ransom. Just doesn't make economic sense. Businesses at the end of the day are out there to turn a profit, and the options are clear, really, in my mind.
Yeah, that's quite true. Yeah, so chances are if the advice or the legislation is not to pay them, there's every chance that will actually cost more in the long run. I guess there's no guarantees. You pay one and you might not get the decryption key, or they may well still maintain persistence and ransomware you again down the line. But I'm aware that there's kind of, I think, terms and conditions attached to some of these ransomware notes and things like that, that says we promise we won't come and touch you again and we won't come after you again and all that kind of business. So potentially it's a bit more nuanced than please don't pay it. There's probably a lot of things to consider here, I think, and the return on investment kind of scenario, the equation that you have to balance up of, do we pay it or do we rebuild it? That's going to cost a fortune. Clearly, massive influence here, particularly in these times where there's a cost of living crisis and everything's going up in price and so on and so forth. The financial and the economic side of this will really play a large part of it ultimately. Yeah. I guess the question I would have, Hugh, is that what can organizations do to kind of protect themselves here? So my view is, if I would always advise someone not to pay a ransom, but that's not just the advice on its own doesn't necessarily just stand up, because it's all well and good sitting here and saying don't pay one, but there's for me there's actions that people can take to help them in the future if something does happen. So about getting the preparedness in place, making sure that they've got an ability to recover well and quickly is the key things here. So reducing that 800 grand spenders in the example down to the same level, a couple of days worth of effort to get back on our feet is potentially the things that people can do to get themselves into a good place. Is there anything else beyond that that people can do to help with that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the key, isn't it? I think I deal with quite a few clients who are working with the mindset of I must prevent this this ransomware attack from occurring. I must prevent this. Yes, obviously we want to take as many steps as we can. We don't want to leave the doors open. But I think that mindset is dangerous, given these ransomware gangs are getting incredibly sophisticated. They are basically large companies. I'm sure they'd appear on the FTSE 100, some of these gangs, if they were legitimate businesses. And so the ways they're working are very advanced. And so against the average organization, I'd say you almost have to assume that you're going to get breached. That's basically, it's not an if, it's when. And so, as you said, make sure that we can bring that recovery time and recovery costs down as much as we can. We've seen organizations that have their entire estate as infrastructure as code with cloud-based remote backups. You get ransomware, you press restart on the system, and suddenly everything's back again. Well, great. They would never have any reason to pay a ransom because they can just click go and things are back. Versus more static organizations that might not take backups or infrequent backups, where suddenly you're looking at losing maybe a year's worth of progress.
Yeah, for sure. And it's you'll hear people tend to talk to this point around basic hygiene, but I would contest the basic side of things. I think these things are quite difficult to do and implement at scale, and it's easy for people like us as consultants to kind of say, well, yeah, point of thing, that's exactly what you should do. You should go away and implement that right now. But there's the implications for that. It's not always as simple as let's pull the trigger on that thing. And I think there's a layered approach here. So yes, one thing is being able to prevent it well, but the next bit is how to recover so fast as well. So a couple of different layers to the equation, I think, would really help in these cases.
Absolutely. I mean, defense in depth is the approach that we always want to work with, right?
Of course, yeah. So that kind of concludes the discussion on the NCSC and the ICO open or joint letter that they published. I guess there's one part. Well, we had a few questions since the last threat briefing. One of which is related to quantum computing and encryption. So we'll cover that one separately to that person involved, just because it doesn't really fit into the topics of today. So hopefully that's okay. But the other question we did have, and is a bit more of a general question, but certainly we can fit it into today's topics, would be, and this is from Colin Williams, and it's what's the one thing we should leave this meeting to sort out if we don't have it in place right now?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one. I think, given what we've discussed today, I'd say a really good one would be to go out and look at that segregation between personal use and company use, especially around things like accounts in the browser. Okay, excellent. And from my view would be, I think I would agree with that, Hugh, but I'd also encourage people to start to think about a defense to attacks in multiple layers. You look at the Cisco example that we covered earlier on, and when you look back through the technical descriptions, yes, they've got access to the VPN and into a Citrix box, but then to progress, they had to then move through different layers of security controls that are in place. So I think having that mindset of when we do build something, or when we build something new, or we re-architect something, have a think about the multiple layers and different levels of controls that you can put in around an asset, for example, to try and protect it more. Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. That concludes us for today. I think we're right on time as well. That's 16:30. So, Hugh, again, as always, appreciate your time, appreciate your insights. It's been a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you everyone on the call for attending. Again, really do appreciate it. Any questions in the future, please do send them in as well, and we'll try and tie them into the subjects of the month and answer them on there. Again, thank you everyone, and have a good rest of the week. Cheers. Bye-bye.